Hi class, in this video, we're going to go over chapter 24, aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So this will be something a little bit slightly different than what you're used to in the previous chapters. So we learn about the supply demand diagram, but that's on the individual good, individual services. For this aggregate supply demand and aggregate demand, aggregate supply, we look at the economy on the bigger picture. So now we're looking at the economy as a total supply economy and then the total demand economy. So first, let's talk about a little background history. So this, well, depends on how old you are. Many of you guys probably don't remember this when you were just a little kid. So we had a little housing crisis back in 2008 to 2010. So that was the last recession, the last great recession, which we saw a huge drop in our real estate market, that there were many foreclosures in the economy, so many homeowners couldn't pay for the house anymore, and then the banks has to foreclose on the house. So this really brings to us the question, right? So what is the supply demand? So does demand drive supply, or does supply drive demand? And if you look at our housing market, in the 1990s through about 2005, we saw a slowly but gradually increasing in the number of new homes sold. So there are more and more houses being sold. But this increasing in the number of transactions does creating a little bubble here, right? Because we only have so many people in the country. If you keep selling more and more houses, we don't have the market to buy more and more houses, right? So that bubble really burst by about 2006. So '06 bubble burst, and then that really caused the recession in 2008. So we saw the housing market really crash down, and then really didn't reach the trough until 2010. And after 2010, it slowly recovered. Now, it's a shame that this number only shows to up to the year 2020, so right before the pandemic. If you guys interested, look at the new number. The 2021 is over here, and the 2022 is like right here. So the number is still increasing very dramatically. But 2023, a number come down a little bit. That's because now we have high inflation and also higher interest rate. The higher interest rate really discouraged consumers from buying more homes. So this housing market. There's so many factors into it, right? So besides what you see in the normal supply demand for the housing market, there are also bigger picture behind it, right? So what are the bigger pictures that's impacting the overall supply demand for the homes? So that's one thing we're going to study for our aggregate demand, aggregate supply diagram. So think about the difference between a micro economics and a macroeconomics. So for 2301, we're looking at the macroeconomics, looking at the bigger picture, right? So the information impacting entire economy, and then we can divide our economists into two groups. And you guys probably heard this before. They have the supply side economists and then the demand side economists. So for the supply side economists, they believe the most important factor that can determine our economic outlook is the supply. That if you can help induce more supply in the economy, demand will come along with it, right? So supply comes before demand. But the demand side economists believe the other way, thinking, hey, maybe it's the demand that's the leading indicator of the economy, but supply come behind that. And this supply demand argument is really like a chicken and egg, right? So which one comes first? So there are two different camps in all the economists, so the supply side economics and the demand side economics. And we're gonna learn more about this, the different belief in different theories in economics in the later or next two chapters. So first, let's talk about a couple of beliefs here. So first, we have Shay's law. It says supply creates its own demand. That this economists, we call them the neoclassical economists, that they believe that supply is really important in the economy. That once you produce the good, that once you have this overall supply in the economy, depends on different price level, demand will be meeting the supply at different price level. So for example, right, so let's suppose we decide to creating more incentive, so lower taxes for a company to produce more goods and services. Now that way, holding everything constant, if lower taxes, company pay lower taxes, they have a bigger profit, they have more incentive to produce more good. And when they produce more good, that means there's overall a bigger supply in the economy. and that will lead into lower prices. And with lower prices, according to lower demand, demand come along, right? So that's the belief of the neoclassical economists, that if you work with the overall supply, or this keyword here called the aggregate supply, the overall supply for the economy, that the demand will come along with it, right? So the most important factor for economic growth, so grow the economy, is really coming from the supply side. Now, on the other end, we have the Keynes law. So Keynes law is named after a very famous economist. His name is John Maynard Keynes, or John Maynard Keynes. So Keynes theory was really made popular back in the 1930s, 1940s. So with President FDR, we had a New Deal. So if you guys study if you remember what you learned in your U.S. history class, if you look at the Great Depression, so during the Great Depression at the very beginning, our U.S. government under President Hoover was following the neoclassical view of economics, that we believe the government should be more hands-off, laissez-faire. Remember laissez-faire? So more hands-off, have the market fix itself, and then eventually going to recover. But it didn't work. And then FDR coming in and introduced the New Deal, so which means we had a very active government involved in the market. So government pick up the slack of whatever the market demand wasn't purchasing. So that New Deal follows the belief of John Maynard Keynes. So demand creates supply. So when there's enough demand for it, company will produce the good to meet those supply, right? So therefore, government starts spending more money in the economy, creating more demand in the economy, and that help the companies to come along and produce more goods and services. So two different sides over here. All right, so next let's go over some definitions. So the aggregate demand aggregate supply diagram is a model shows that what determines the total supply and total demand in the economy, and then the total supply and the total demand interacting at a macroeconomic level. So again, the regular supply demand curve looking at individual good, individual services, individual market, but now look at all the market economy. So the cars, the groceries, the houses, the food, everything. And then for aggregate supply is a total supply of everything by the firms produced at different price level. And then the aggregate supply curve is just a graphical representation of our aggregate supply. But the difference is that if you look at our regular supply demand diagram, on the vertical axis, it's measured by the price, but we're looking at the overall supply, so all the supply. So on the vertical axis, it's not price anymore, that's for individual goods and services, but on the vertical axis, it's now called a price level, so it measures all the goods and services. And on the horizontal axis, it used to be called quantity, but we're looking at the quantity of everything. So this is not measured by the real GDP, right? So the axes are changed. Vertical axis is our price level. Horizontal axis is our real GDP. And I also know what's a potential GDP. So for every country, you can have a potential production. So what is your potential? What you're supposed to be producing? And then the goal of every single economy is to be at the potential GDP. It doesn't mean that we always can get there. That's more than often we're going to be falling short of our potential GDP. There are also some situations we can be going over our potential GDP for a very short term time. But that potential GDP is where we try to be at. And the potential GDP, you also have your full employment GDP, right? They mean the same thing, right? So at a full employment, that means anybody who wants to work is able to find the work when the economy is very, very good. Now, remember we learned about the different type of unemployment in the last chapter, right? There is the frictional unemployment, structural, and cyclical. So at full employment, you are still going to have some unemployment. So at full employment, you're still going to have your frictional unemployment. There are people who are unemployed due to personal reason. You're still going to have structural unemployment, so people whose job skill are no longer needed in the economy. But you're going to have zero cyclical unemployment. So no unemployment due to recession, right? So that's the full employment GDP. And that's also where the potential GDP is. So putting everything on the diagram, Again, like we mentioned, on the vertical axis, we don't have price anymore. Now we have a price level. So the price of everything in the economy. And every time when the price level is increasing, that's called inflation. And anytime it's decreasing, that's called deflation. And on the horizontal axis, we have our real GDP. So the quantity of everything in the economy. And then this line here, this hypothetical line, that is our potential GDP. That's where the economy want to be at. All right, so next, let's talk about our aggregate demand. So aggregate demand is the total demand of everything for the economy. And there are different factors impacting our aggregate demand. And there are four factors. There are consumption, investment, government spending, and then net export. Now, does this sound a little familiar to you? Something you learned before? Right? Remember the four components for GDP? Right? They're the same four components for our aggregate demand curve. So for everything that's produced in America or in the country, they can be only purchased by four components. Right? So only four different segments of the economy can purchase this good. They're either the consumption by all the consumers, investment by all the business, government by all the government spendings, and net export for all the import export. So the four component can shift and change our aggregate demand curve. So whenever you hear this four component change, that means our aggregate demand will be shifted. And then just like the regular supply demand curve, increase to your right, decrease to your left. Okay, so now for the aggregate demand curve, it's just a graphical representation of our aggregate demand. And it's also similar to our aggregate supply. You're going to see the same axis, so price level on the vertical axis, and then real GDP on the horizontal axis. And if you notice the aggregate demand curve, it's just like the regular demand curve, it is downward sloping. So as the price level increasing, so everything getting more and more expensive, then our four component of the aggregate demand will be decreasing as well. Right? So more expensive, then everything will be purchased or demanded less in the economy. All right, so we have the aggregate supply curve that's always going up, and we have the aggregate demand curve that's always going down. That means eventually there will be an intersection here, right? So this intersection is very similar to what we learned in our regular supply demand diagram. So this is also called the equilibrium. So the equilibrium between the between your aggregate demand and supply, that's where the economy will be settled on. So for this diagram here, at this equilibrium, we have a price level of 90, and then the real GDP of 8,800. But if you notice that what you see here, that our potential is at what is how much, like 9,500. So the potential GDP was 9,500, but for the current equilibrium, we're only producing at 8,800, so actually falling short of our potential production. Okay, so so we use this potential GDP to see how good the economy is. Every time you're falling short of our potential GDP, that means economy is in recession. Now, anytime if you're going beyond that, so it is possible to go beyond that, but only for a very short time period, that means the economy is getting very, very hot. We have two types of supply curve in the aggregate demand model, aggregate supply model. So one's called a short run supply curve. So for short run supply curve, you're still going to see the cost of production being fixed. So how much company pay for the resources are fixed. So giving that information when the price level changes. So let's suppose I sell chicken fried rice, and then how much I pay to produce my chicken fried rice is fixed. So for every order, it costs me $3. But how much I can sell the chicken fried rice changes. So at a higher price level, I can sell my chicken fried rice for more than holding costs constant. I want to sell more chicken fried rice. And then vice versa, that at a lower price level, so what I can sell for chicken fried rice is less now, I make lower profit, then I want to sell less chicken fried rice. So in the short run, when we're holding our cost constant, so cost doesn't change, then you're going to see a positive relationship between how much the companies want to produce versus how much the actual price they can sell their good. So in the short run supply curve, in the short span of time, your supply curve will look something positive sloped, and that's going to be short run supply curve. Now, in the long run supply curve, we're going to assume that all the prices and all the costs are flexible. So as time goes, everything can change. So imagine when the price goes up, so how much I can sell my chicken and fried rice increases. At the same time, my cost of production increase as well. Then my profit wouldn't change anymore. So in the long run, when everything becomes flexible, we're going to see the long run supply curve being perfectly vertical. And this vertical supply curve is the same idea behind our potential production, our potential GDP. So we're going to have two supply curve in this model here. Your short run supply curve is upward sloping, and then the long run supply curve, that will representing your potential GDP for the economy. All right, guys, so there are different factors that can change and shift our aggregate demand and also both short run and long run aggregate supply curve. So for the aggregate demand curve, the same four components that change our GDP are the same four components that will shift our aggregate demand curve, right? So if it's a consumption, investment, government spending, net export, anything about those four factor changes, that will be shifting our aggregate demand curve. And if it's increasing, we're shifting to the right, and decreasing, we're shifting to the left. So just like our regular supply demand curve. So we're going to have our price level on the vertical axis, our real GDP on the horizontal axis. Sorry about the handwriting. I'm using my mouse over here. And then your aggregate demand curve is going down. That's your AD. So every time it's increasing, we're shifting to the right. Every time it's decreasing, we're shifting to the left. So some examples that will shift our aggregate demand curve, for consumptions. Think about consumer confidence. That's how good our consumer feels about the future or current condition that will influence their current consumption behavior, right? So let's suppose the economy is doing very, very good. Everybody all believe that we're going to be getting, higher income in the near future, that our jobs are very secure. Then we're going to be making some big purchase, right? So buying appliances, buying new car, buying new houses. So a good consumer confidence can really increase our current consumptions. But vice versa, if you feel very insecure about the future, then you're going to see a decrease in your current consumption behavior. So imagine the economy is very, very good, and all the consumers thinking, hey, our job is not secure anymore. What if I lose my job tomorrow? Well, today, would I still be buying a new car? Or would I be buying a new house? No, I'm going to save the money, right? But that saving is reducing our consumption. So consumer confidence, you guys are going to hear this a lot. That will influence our consumption and then shift our aggregate demand curve. Consumer income, obviously, that will also change the consumer behavior. Investor income, same thing as a consumer income, a consumer confidence, and I also think about the government spending. So for government spending, this is just purely what is the policy on how much money government want to spend. So for example, if government spend more money, we're going to be shifting our aggregate demand curve to the right. If it's less money, then we're going to be shifting to the left. Net export is dealing with your trade, your import-export. So if you have a change in the foreign income, so imagine all the foreigners become rich. Well, they're going to buy more US produced stuff, right? So buy more US produced jeans, shoes, and that will increase our aggregate demand in America. And then exchange rate can also impact the economy, right? So if you have a very strong dollar, a strong dollar is actually bad for our net export, because strong dollar means everything produced in America, which is being paid by US dollar, is now becoming more expensive with a strong dollar, right? So therefore our export goes down and the import goes up. But if you have a lower exchange rate, so your dollar become weaker, that means everything produced overseas is more expensive now, and everything produced in America that's being paid with a weak US dollar is cheaper. So our export goes up, import goes down, right? So the exchange rate can also impact our net export and also our aggregate demand level. Now, for the supply curve, for the short run supply curve, there's three factors can shift our short run supply curve. Resource cost, that's how much it costs to produce the goods and services. Tax on business, how much business are paying taxes. And then lastly, social institution, that's our government regulation. So let's imagine if our government says, no more pollution regulations, then you guys can produce whatever you want and pollute however much you want. Now, that'd be bad. But that will help increase our aggregate supply curve in the short run, right? That's a social institution. And then for the aggregate supply curve, also like aggregate demand curve, if it's, oh, that looks very, very bad. Let me redraw this. If it's increasing, we're shifting to the right. Decreasing, we're shifting to the left, right? So for aggregate supply curve, this is your short run, SRAS, short run aggregate supply curve. If it's increasing, we're shifting to the right, and decreasing, we're shifting to the left. And these three factors are the reasons why we can shift our aggregate supply curve, short run. And then for the long run aggregate supply curve, there are four factors: land, labor, capital, and technology. Does this sound a little familiar to you guys? You've seen it before somewhere? Remember our production possibility frontier? The four factor can shift our PPF. The same four factors can shift our long run aggregate supply curve. So land, is how much resources you have. Labor, how many employees you have, how many workers you have, and also what are the skill set for the workers, right? So if the workers are better trained, then we're gonna have more capacity to produce more goods and services. And next, capitals, so how much equipment, tools you have in the country. Infrastructure is also important for capitals. And lastly, technologies. So any type of new technology can influence our overall production for the country. Now for the long run supply curve, again, if it's increasing, we're shifting to the right, decreasing to the left. Now remember, your long run supply curve is a perfectly vertical, right? So this will be your long run aggregate supply. So if it's increasing, we're shifting to the right, and decreasing, we're shifting to the left, right? So that's how our long run supply curve shifted. So between all three lines, if it's increasing, it's to the right, decreasing to the left. So let me, we have on this diagram here, let's go to the next slide. So let's say we draw this. We're gonna try this very hard, draw a straight line. Well, that's the best I can do for now. So we have the price level. We'll have the real GDP. And then we'll have the short run aggregate supply curve. We have the long run aggregate supply curve. And then we have our aggregate demand curve. Now imagine this is on the same intersection, okay? So this is the long run equilibrium for the country. So that's the price level gonna be, let's call this one PL1, price level 1, and that's the real GDP, Y1. So this is the potential production for the country. Now, every time if you are operating to the left of the long run supply curve, we have recession. And then anytime you're operating to the right of the long run supply curve, we have expansion. That means the economy is growing very fast. So the problem for the recession, so let's suppose we're shifting our aggregate demand curve to the right. So shifting to the right, so let's call this AD2. Now at AD2, we have a new equilibrium. Let's call this Y2, and this one here will be PL2. So price level is a little lower now. At a lower price level, also going to see that at this equilibrium, we have a lower real GDP level. So this, that means economy is currently operating below the potential. We're going to see high unemployment, and that's the downfall of a recession. We're going to see high unemployment. Now vice versa, if the economy is operating to the right, let me see what color should I, let's see this color black here. So operating to the right, let's call this AD3. Now AD3, we're going to be over here, right? That's AD3. So price level 3, and over here will be our real GDP at Y3. Now at this new equilibrium, we're doing great that we're operating to the right side of our long run supply curve. That means the economy is expanding, that everybody have a job, very, very low unemployment. So unemployment is not a problem anymore. But notice how the price level is increased from PL1 to PL3 now. So this increase in price level, that's the downside of our expansion. That means we're going to have inflation in the economy, right? So every time to the left, then you tend to have a recession. Anytime to the right, then you're going to be seeing inflation in the economy. So that's the dynamic for this diagram. You also need to know there's 3 sections for this diagram. So if you look at our short-run aggregate supply curve, the bottom portion here is called a Keynesian zone. The top portion here is called a neoclassical zone. And then the middle section is called an intermediate zone. Now we're going to talk more about this more in detail in the next couple of chapters on the neoclassical and then Keynesian view of economics. But this is why it's important. Now remember at the beginning of the class we talked about the Shay's law, the Keynesian law. So this diagram here really illustrates that. So for the Keynesian zone, so when you're operating at the lower portion of your aggregate supply curve here, whenever the aggregate demand curve change, so if your aggregate demand curve change, let's say over here, I don't know, 2, then notice we're going to see a big change in our real GDP, right? So whenever you add a Keynesian zone, a change in the aggregate demand curve is very effective to influence economic outlook, right? That's the Keynesian zone. But if you add a top portion here, when you add the neoclassical zone, changing aggregate demand cause very little changes, right? So if we change the AD curve to the right again, so let me erase this. So if I change my AD curve to the right, let's call this AD2. Notice at this new equilibrium compared to our old equilibrium over here, there's just very little change in the real GDP, right? So now changing aggregate demand curve is not being effective anymore. So remember the neoclassical view economics says that according to Shay's law, the supply is important. It will be driven, so whenever supply comes, demand will come with it. So in this diagram, if you add a neoclassical zone, if you want to change the economy, don't change aggregate demand. Let's shift our aggregate supply curve. So if your aggregate supply curve is shifted to the right, let's say we go over here, let's call this one SRAS2, and right there, that's your new equilibrium, right? So compare the new equilibrium to the old one. Notice there's a bigger change now. So that's been a very, very effective change, right? So in the Keynesian zone, changing aggregate demand curve is effective. In the neoclassical zone, changing the aggregate supply curve is effective, okay? All right, we talked about this already. So lastly, in the intermediate zone, so both type of policy can work. Both the aggregate demand, aggregate supply curve change will change our equilibrium and will change our economic outlook. And remember, all we try to do here is try to move closer to our potential real GDP or our long-run aggregate supply curve. Because whenever you're at long-run aggregate supply curve, we're operating at our potential production, and that is good. Okay. All right, guys. That's it for this chapter. Have any question, let me know, and I will see you for the next chapter. Bye-bye.